Hey, this is Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Today I'll be showing you how to replace worn out parts on a Showa shock. Is your shock leaking? If it is, today I'm going to show you how to fix it. We'll be replacing the oil seal and some other parts on the Showa shock that came off an 05 CRF450R, but the procedures is pretty similar from 2002 to 2008 and even for some of the 450X models. To do this job, you'll need some basic hand tools, rags, and safety glasses. We'll also be using some tools from Tusk, a shock seal bullet tool, seal head setting tool, shock oil, seal grease, bladder removal tool, and an air pump. We'll also be using a shock preload adjusting tool. We chose to use the PivotWorks shock repair kit because it comes with just about everything you need. You'll also need your OEM service manual for more information, proper procedures, and specs. Now, we already have our shock out of the bike. If you have any questions on doing that, refer to your service manual. So the next thing we need to do is count our clickers. So we'll turn them all the way in and listen for the clicks until they lightly seat. Count those clicks, write them down, and then we'll back out the clickers all the way counterclockwise. This shock also has a high-speed compression adjuster, so we'll count how many turns until it seats and then back it all the way out and write that down. Okay, we're about 1 3/4. Next, we'll measure our spring length, and that way we can get it back to its original preload setting. Now we're ready to clamp our shock into our vise. Another thing I want to point out, this shock, you don't want to crank on it with the vise. Just be really careful and gentle with it, just to make sure we don't damage the body. We want to make sure our threads are clean, and we'll also spray some lube on them and loosen our lock ring, and then back off our preload adjuster. Sometimes it's easier if you loosen the lock ring before you pull the shock off the bike. Next, we'll need to remove our spring seat, and to do that, we might need to tap it down with a hammer and then remove the retaining clip and pull that off with the spring. With the spring removed, we're ready to release the nitrogen from the shock. Keep in mind that it's high pressure, so be careful when you release the pressure, and then we'll remove the valve core. Now we can pull the shock from the vise, remove the compression adjuster, and drain the oil. And when we drain the oil, we'll want to pump the shaft a few times up and down to get all the oil out. Oh, that smells nasty. With the oil drained, we'll put our shock body back into the vise, and we'll use a socket to press down on our bladder cap. And if it doesn't press down easy, we'll use a rubber mallet and press it down until it's past the circlip groove. With the circlip exposed, we'll clean it off and pull the circlip out using our clip removal tool. We'll clean the retaining clip groove again, and then we'll take our bladder removal tool, and then we'll slowly rock out our bladder. And this one looks pretty terrible, but that's all right because we'll be replacing it anyway. Next, we'll move our shock shaft up, and our body cap has 2 holes on it, and we'll take a punch and punch it up from both of those holes. To hold this cap up, we'll use a zip tie. You can also use a rubber band or just tie it up with some string, whatever you have. Okay, so we're going to take the shock back out of the vise, and we need to clean around the seal head and get some of this dirt out of here. With that clean, we'll put it back into the vise. Then we'll use our Race Tech seal setting tool and press the seal head down. And what that does, it exposes our circlip, so we can take our circlip pick. When we pulled this circlip out, we noticed there's still quite a bit of sand in there from when we pushed our seal head setting tool down. So I'm going to take the shock assembly back out of the vise and We will spray some of that sand out just to keep everything clean as possible when we pull this apart. So now I'll put it back into the vise. We'll pull this shock shaft out. You might have to work it up and down a little bit. And if it's too tight, we can take a rubber mallet and hit the bottom of our shock gently. Okay, we got it loose. I'm gonna put the oil pan back under the shock and we'll pull it the rest of the way out. Next, we can dump our remaining shock oil out of our shock body. And then we'll clamp the bottom of the shock in our vise. Next, we'll need to remove the nut from the shock shaft. So normally they're pinned to the shaft. Ours isn't, and that tells us the shaft has been replaced before. Now, sometimes the coating on them can be worn through or the shaft can actually bend. So at some point, something's happened to the shaft and has been replaced. We're going to heat this up and remove it, but if yours is pinned, be sure to refer to your service manual for instructions on how to file the pinning down. And also you need to be really careful on these shafts because this shaft holds the rebound adjuster and you don't want to be filing on the top. So again, make sure you're looking at the service manual for instructions how to do that. Now we're ready to remove the nut. We'll put a screwdriver on the end of the shaft and we'll remove the shim stack and piston assembly. Next, we'll remove the remaining components and set them in order. With everything disassembled, we'll thoroughly clean everything and inspect all our seals and parts for damage. So one thing I want to point out is when we were cleaning everything, we actually had some metal shavings on our shim stack. So we've sprayed them off, but we want to make sure these shims are really clean. So how we do that, we're taking some mechanics wire and we'll slide the shims onto the mechanics wire to keep them in order and close the top so we don't lose anything or get anything out of order. Another thing, this piston ring on here, it's looking pretty worn out and our kit luckily came with a new one. So we'll also be replacing this. Another thing to note is we're first pulling off our compression stack and we'll leave everything else together on the screwdriver. And we'll wire this compression stack together so we can't lose anything. And remove the piston and rebound stack. When you remove this piston, keep in mind that it's directional. So when you take it off, make sure you know which side you face down. So what we're going to do is take it off and place the compression side down. We are placing the compression side down, and if you do happen to get it mixed up, the compression side has these bigger ports and the rebound side has the smaller ports. When we're cleaning, it's important to clean the end of the shaft to clean out this rebound adjuster just in case any metal shavings got down in there. So to replace our piston ring, we'll cut the old piston ring off with a razor blade, remove the two O-rings with a pick, then we'll install our two new O-rings, making sure they're coated in shock oil. Now, getting the ring on is kind of a tricky process. We used a 48mm seal bullet just so we don't cut the edges, and we just worked it on slowly, making sure everything was covered in oil. So if you're going to do this, take your time. With our parts clean, we're ready to inspect them. We'll start out with the bladder. You'll want to look for any deformation in this. This seals the oil in the reservoir, so it's always a good idea to replace it when it's out. We've got this bumper. If this is worn out or cracked, you'll definitely want to replace it. Our kit came with a new one, so that'll just be convenient to do. And we have our shaft. You want to check this for any nicks, pitting, or if this chrome is worn, and also to make sure it's completely straight and not bent. And moving on to our seal head, when you inspect this, You'll obviously want to check your dust seal, and always you'll want to replace the oil seal. There's this rubber bumper, you'll inspect that and the spring, and always replace this O-ring on it. Now our kit came with a completely new seal head, so we'll just replace the entire thing as a unit. And moving on to our compression adjuster, we'll replace these two O-rings, and we've already replaced the piston ring and the two O-rings underneath it on our piston. Another note, when you're reassembling, always make sure to use a new nut. Now with the shock body, we'll want to inspect it for any cracks or damage and make sure our rings spin free. Now we'll take our shock shaft and install it into the vise, and then start reinstalling the components exactly how we took them off. Now we're ready to install our seal head. So to do that, we'll be using our Tusk seal bullet. Now one note, when you're at this point, make sure all the components are completely clean. So now we're going to take some seal grease and put some on our seals in the seal head. And I'm going to put some on both the dust seal and on the oil seal. And we'll take this and slide it onto our shaft. Just work it nice and slow and don't force it on. Okay, now that the seal head's on, we'll remove our bullet. We'll take our clean shim stacks, and making sure we keep the same order, we'll slide everything on. And it might take a little bit of finesse to get all these shims on, but if you work them back and forth, they should just slide on. Then we'll take our nut and apply some high strength thread lock to it. We'll torque the nut to 27 foot-pounds. After we torque the nut, we'll want to wipe off any excess Loctite on there. And then we'll take our hammer and punch, and we'll peen it in 3 places. Now we're ready to install our shock body into the vise. Now we can take the damper assembly and we'll apply some shock oil to it, both the piston ring and this seal head O-ring, and even a little bit of oil right into our body at the top. Now when we work this in, be careful not to damage any seals or force it. Just take your time and work it in smooth. Now I'm going to do the same thing we did when we were taking this apart, and I'll use a zip tie to help keep this cap out of the way. Now we'll take the seal head and slide it down, and we'll take our seal head setting tool and push the seal head down and make sure it's past the circlip groove. After that, we'll install the circlip into the circlip groove. Next, we'll pull up on the shock shaft and make sure the seal head seats against the circlip. So that's sealed against there. We can now cut this zip tie off, and then we'll use a plastic mallet to hit this end cap on. And it's always a good idea, there's 2 drain holes in here. Make sure you line up one of the drain holes with the lowest part of the shock when it's going to be installed on the bike. That way if there's moisture in there, it can also drain out. Now we'll take the bladder and install it onto the shock body cap. We'll just start on one end and work it around. So with this on, we'll coat it in shock oil, and then we'll also coat the edge of this reservoir in oil and install it just past the ring groove, and then install the circlip. Now that we've installed our circlip and made sure it sits nicely in our ring groove, we'll pull up on our bladder using our bladder removal tool. You can also do this using an air pump to pump up the bladder to seat against that ring. The last thing we'll do before we flip the shock over is install our Schrader valve into our bladder. Now we'll flip the shock over. We'll install the shock into the vise so the top of this reservoir is level, and we'll pull all the way out on the shock and fill it with a little bit of oil and move the shock a little bit in and out. This is where having our rebound adjuster all the way out is going to help us bleed this. And we'll do that, and we'll periodically have to refill the shock with oil as we do it. Another thing I want to point out, this shock, you don't want to crank on it with the vise. Just be really careful and gentle with it, just to make sure we don't damage the body. Now when you're pumping the shock shaft in and out, make sure you go really slow or you'll end up with shock oil all over the shop. So as long as you're going nice and slow, you'll be okay, but you still might end up with some oil on your shoes. You can use a rubber mallet or the end of a screwdriver to tap the shock body to help get all the air bubbles out. We'll take our Tusk suspension pump and we'll fill the bladder to 7.1 psi. After we've done that, we'll tip the shock body up and get our reservoir as vertical as possible just to get any air bubbles out. And we can tap on that to help get any bubbles out too. And then as soon as you see all the air bubbles come out, we can take our shock oil, we'll tip it back a little bit and just fill the oil all the way up to the top of the reservoir. Now we can take our compression adjuster and coat the O-rings with oil, and we'll install it. And we'll torque this to 21 foot-pounds. The next step, we'll want to fill the shock with nitrogen. And to do this, I like to do it before we put the spring on. That way, when we fill it up, we can press all of the air out of the bladder and fill it with only nitrogen. And we can also make sure after it's filled that the shock works correctly and the damping rod extends fully like it should and there's no binding. Now, if you don't have a nitrogen setup at your house, you can also take it to your local shop and they should be able to fill it for you. Now that we have the shock filled with nitrogen, we can compress the damper assembly and make sure it extends fully and check for proper function, as well as check around our sealing areas for any leaks. Next thing, we'll install our spring, and something to keep in mind is that this spring only goes on one way, so make sure the bigger end sits against our lock rings, and we'll go ahead and do that and then install our spring seat and circlip. Now we'll flip the shock over and tighten down our lock rings to our initial setting where the preload was. Now we'll set our compression and rebound clickers as well as our high-speed compression adjustment. And that's all there is to rebuilding your shock on your CRF450R. So if you need any parts or special tools, check out our website. We have just about anything you could want for your bike. And if you like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thanks for watching. Oh, that smells nasty.